Hey, everybody. Welcome to the second of 3 conversations on preaching from the margins for Woman Preach in collaboration with Bishop Yvette Plunder, the presiding prelate for the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. And in full disclosure, I'm on I hate to lead with this, Bishop and Religious Leaders Board for the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. People always miss the religious leaders part, and so then they want to call me bishop. I'm not a bishop. I ain't even trying to be. So we're about to have about a 30-minute conversation in honor of, we just passed World AIDS Day, and we're going to talk about preaching with relationship to this ongoing pandemic, endemic, not just AIDS, but anytime we have medical issues that get made into moral issues. That's kind of what we're going to talk about tonight. And I know no better conversation partner than my friend. We just figured out it's been 29 and a half years that we have known each other, Reverend Dr. the Bishop Yvette Flunder. So welcome, Bishop Flunder, for being the starting pastor at City of Refuge, a great gospel music singer, and the presiding prelate bishop over the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries.
Well, thank you so much, sister. Yes, we do. We go a ways back. And I am so blessed and pleased to be a part of this initiative and be a part of whatever it is that Women Preach is doing to affect and expand the role of women preachers who preach both with their voices, with their lives and actions in this time in which we live. So thank you so much for the invitation.
I'm so glad you're here. So I'm just gonna jump in. When we were trying to think about how we wanted to have conversations with you, first one was just a free fall. We want to know about you and everything, but we knew we would be close to World AIDS Day. It's passed yesterday, but the issue around preaching and the way in which people demonize medical issues when they're preaching rises up when we think about World AIDS Day. At least it does for me. And one of the sermons you preached before that lives with me, I think you were in the White House when you first did this, called Just Boil the Water. So I want to start there, because I think in that sermon you were talking about how during the Black Plague, they did the same thing, where they just made it a moral issue, not taking seriously the medical scientific issues. So jump in here however you want to on this conversation.
Well, I had an opportunity to speak at the White House that day in relationship to HIV and AIDS. And I chose the topic, Just Boil the Water, for the very things that you just lifted up. The incredible epidemic of cholera, the bubonic and pneumonic plague, the Spanish flu. We could go on and on and on. Religion has a tendency to work very poorly during times like that. Religion, particularly when I speak and in terms of how do people of faith respond in a time of plague and disaster. Some of it is rooted in the fact that we have a concept of an angry God who just basically stays pissed. And whenever something really bad goes on, that is the evidence, right? So one of the first things that was done in all of those plagues was to blame some group of people for being responsible for it. It was the Irish, primarily during the cholera. This was before the race that we call white existed. For those of you that may not know, the construct of being white is the combination of French and English and Irish and Scottish, who when they got to the shores here, became a race, a new race called white. But back in the days of the cholera, Irish people were Irish.
Right.
And they were sort of on the butt end of who was wonderful during that time and blamed for virtually everything. So when they had the majority of the diseases that were attributed to cholera, it was thought that it was because they were inherently evil and wicked, that, and if they could get their lives right. And I must also digress and say that this was sort of the beginning of the great revivals that moved us to our conversations now about conservative Christianity, which is sort of the offspring of those great revivals that happened during that time, aimed at the Irish particularly, but also at the Scottish. And these were the people who were stuck in tenements in tight spaces where we got terminologies like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the bathwater was really nasty. And it started with the fathers bathing first, and the baby could get lost in the darkness of the bathwater.
Right.
This was a terrible time. And immediately the condemnation went to the Irish. And I said to them, if they had only known that cholera could have been prevented by just boiling the water, we didn't need a scripture for it. We didn't need to blame anybody for it. We did not need to victimize and vilify. Just boil the water. We have a very similar experience right now with this epidemic that is our cause du jour. Even while AIDS is still a pandemic, we have moved to the conversation about COVID. And there are some just boil the water responses that we can have without having to go through all sorts of stuff about and giving it all to Jesus and God, an angry Jesus and an angry God.
So I hear you and I agree. You know, I agree with you because I brought the sermon up. But I do think in our context, I think one of the things that preachers feel stuck with is they have to have a theological reason for every historical moment. There must be a theological answer. So you've been preaching at City of Refuge and I mean, and ministering to people who struggled with and dealing with HIV/AIDS, living with it. Some people have become no viral detected, you know, but you've been dealing with this as a pastor. People who show up want to know why God did this to them, because, you know, we know this, the way this goes. And you have to preach to a community. The community itself stigmatized because City of Refuge is predominantly, I'm going to use the shorthand word queer, but you know I mean LGBTQIA+. Help cishet folk figure out how not to theologize about medicine.
Yes.
What do you say?
Well, I can tell you this from this vantage point, looking back 30 years, which is when we began to do this work.
Right.
It was called GRID in the basement of our church with some rogue doctors and nurses. And we were holding up experimental drugs on coat hangers, trying to help people to live. I can say that the fact that HIV and AIDS is still a pandemic has everything to do with the fact that we started way too late, understanding that it was an equal opportunity virus. That reality made things extraordinarily problematic for the communities that we serve. Of course, that included same-gender loving people, but it included people with a history of substance abuse, people who were in tattoo parlors, people who had their ears pierced. There's any number of things, but primarily the thought was it was God's punishment against the HIV community. And even the pastors who preached during that time to bring hope always suggested that if people would change their lives in some way as same-gender loving people, and particularly men would change their lives, that this reality would. So here we are again in a very similar reality, a twin pandemic. They're running hand in hand. And if we could simply do our work and understand that species to species, person to person, passing of certain viruses for which the other species does not have an immunogen in our systems to push back against it, is the reason for epidemics. It doesn't have to be spiritualized. It doesn't have to be glorified. What we have to do is find some way to help people not die from it while human beings are developing the internal immunogens that we need to push back against it, either by vaccination or by having it live in us long enough that we naturally get the internal immunogens to push back. It's not rocket science, but once again, what we have a tendency to do is find a group of people that are hated and diminished and blame that group of people That is the sadness and the brokenness, because during times like this, so many people of faith, some of the whole top layer of some denominations all died in the early time of COVID.
Mhm.
And still, people who rant and rave about not being vaccinated, it's not a perfect science, by the way, but it is what we have. Not being vaccinated are themselves dying. They are leaving their children, they are leaving their churches, they are leaving their communities, because they are determined to believe that the people who are going to die from this are the people that they think are worthy of death.
Right.
That is sad to me.
Yeah, I'm talking about when GRID, it was first called,
Mhm.
begun. I mean, I remember vividly all the conversations about, this God is taking out the homosexual,
Mhm.
and, they added Black,
Yeah.
whether they meant it or not. And I remember when Ryan White got sick
Yes.
and how confusing that was
Yes.
for these religious people
Yes.
who have decided that this was God's way of taking out queer folk, right?
Where was his sin?
Right. And then they didn't know
Right.
what to do with that. And
Right.
so I think this goes back to what I was saying about helping preachers. I think part of what's going on, Bishop, and talk to me about this, is people are so afraid of the unknown
Yes.
that the preacher feels required to
Yes.
give an answer. Back to something you said many years ago about the Bible answer man.
Yes.
They got to have an answer for everything, and they don't want to say, I don't know. And I always say to people, the opposite of faith is not fear, it's certainty. The
Yes.
notion that you can know everything is in itself not a faithful response.
Yes.
So helping people who are faced with inscrutable illnesses,
Yes.
although HIV/AIDS is not inscrutable anymore, they
Yes.
really are learning how to treat.
Yes.
And as I think it was Deneen said last night, if you're med compliant, or maybe it was somebody else, med compliant, just like you would be med compliant about diabetes,
Yes.
then the answer is with you, and you don't have to moralize that.
Right.
So that's maybe more of a statement than a question, but speak to that.
Well, some of us fall into this category of the quintessential, essentially inequity, the quintessential villains. So if something happens in communities that fit that description already, then it gets attributed to God. And what it gets weighted by simultaneously is self-hatred, self-loathing.
Yeah.
The sense that people feel, well, yeah, that must be what it is. It's the thing by which we remained in slavery in some ways for the length of time that we did, was because someone convinced us we did not have any other option by the will of God and God's intention. Once they got us to do that, you didn't have to enslave us, we'd enslaved ourselves. And that does not mean that we could get up and be free. But it inaugurated songs like, and before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave. And that attitude is hard to enslave, if you understand what I'm trying to say. I think the same is true for what happens when something is unleashed on a group of people who already feel diminished. And I'll give you another case in point that may not sound like a parallel, but I have said before, as I said last night, that when I was listening to Barack Obama say that he wanted to be president, I absolutely didn't think it was possible. I said, oh no, baby, bless his heart. I'll just tell you the honest to goodness truth. I passed by him and she was talking, and I told mother, I said, bless his little heart. Yeah, I said, that's the boy from Chicago. and it's just ain't nowhere in the world. He doesn't know. Maybe a few years down the line, a couple generations, but it's not going to happen. And I kept passing by him talking on the television. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. And I remember sitting down one day saying, you know what? I said, that boy believes, he believes that, and I had a Hillary Clinton t-shirt on. I took it off. I got me some of the sunshine t-shirts that he was making and putting my t-shirts on and went out there and said, if he really believes it, I'm going to believe it. Then it begged the question, why did he believe it? His father was an African man from Africa, African man. And his mother was a woman of European descent. He went to Chicago. He wasn't raised there. He didn't spend his time coming up in the same places, under the same kinds of experiences. And somehow or another, along the way, he became confident that he was not diminished by this society and that he was prepared. And it was in his eyes, Dr. Bridgman. I looked at his eyes and I said, he believes in himself. And if he can believe it, I'm going to believe it. And I'm going to hope in that. And if I would say to my people today, how do we overcome as same gender loving people, as women, as people of color, as anyone who has been disadvantaged and diminished by someone who feels themselves to be superior? The change for them begins with the change in us.
Right.
We change. When we change,
yeah,
we don't take no
part
for
of
an
what I
answer.
hear you saying, Bishop, because we're talking about preaching about this, is that the preacher herself, himself,
Yes.
themselves
Yes.
have to change. And let me tell you what changed for me about this. I was a chaplain in a hospital and I got a call at 2:00 in the morning and they said, this young man is in pain, but it is not physical. And he's crying nonstop. So I go upstairs, 2:00 in the morning, young white man, and we're in full HIV/AIDS protocol. You know, this was the time when you couldn't go in the room without gloves, without the gown, the whole 9 yards, the mask. And I decided I decided not to do that. Yeah. I don't know what, you know, I would like to say the spirit engaged me. I hope that's what it was, but I decided not to put on the protocol. And I went into the room and he was sobbing and I broke another protocol. I climbed up on the bed and held him. Yes. And he cried for an hour, snotted into my dress, right? Yes. When he could finally speak, I found out he was the son of a Southern Baptist preacher who had disowned him, who had threatened his wife and children that if they called this young man, he would disown them and put them out. His partner had said, who had been his partner for like 10 years, said, I can't stay and watch you die. Too many of our friends have died. And when I held him, he said to me, this is the first human touch I have felt without gloves in 4 years. You hear what I'm saying to you? Oh, I do. I walked out that boy's room and I said, I don't care what nobody say. You cannot convince me that this is God. Yes. The way these people are treating him. I said, here's what I know. If I'm gonna go to hell for loving this young man, yes, ma'am, and for defending this young man, I'm gonna go to hell with gasoline shorts on in a handbasket, glad to go. Because if loving folk is gonna send you to hell, then I'm going. And can I say to that, and if loving self, because you had to have some love for you, in order for you to love him, essentially some love for and purpose and intention. You know that I am a third generation pastor of pastors, what we call a bishop, a third generation. And all of the generations before me in my Pentecostal Kojic family were all men. There isn't one in my age group that fits the description apart from me, but I am the antithesis of what they felt possible
I'm not in the denomination that raised me because I'm a woman preacher, a woman bishop, and a same gender loving woman preacher bishop. I got like 3 strikes before I even get in conversation.
You
with
got
the
like
people.
5 strikes.
I'm in
baby.
deep doo-doo. I mean, that's the part. I mean, the part that is the part. Now, I can preach in tune and come in on a B flat, but I think the bottom line is,
Sure you can.
oh, I say, oh Lord. I mean, there's all of that, but we are the antithesis. We are, and the reason I'm lifting that up is I want to say to someone today that that thing in you that diminishes you inside of you is planted in you just like it was in me. And there's no way in the world we, Dr. Bridgman, could do what we are called to do if we had not done battle with that thing and come out of it victorious. Like Jesus was in the wilderness being tempted of the devil.
Right.
And then he went to the synagogue and said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. I'm here to preach good tidings to the poor. And it wouldn't, if he wasn't tempted, it wouldn't have been a temptation. And I just came from a situation. And I want you to know, I know who I
am. Right.
That's
so yes, the preacher, before you even take a text, before you even figure out what it is to speak a word of encouragement to the congregation, whatever it is that you think you need to be doing as a preacher, what I hear you saying, Bishop, is you need to spend some time in the wilderness with you and God, and maybe you, God, and the devil that plagues you, and get clear about who you are and what you actually believe.
And
like,
you're whole when you're alone.
Yes. And yes. I think for the preacher who wants to speak a word of hope,
yes,
they've also got to contend with the demons that are in their ear.
Yes.
You know, the things they've heard all their life, either about themselves. You know, I literally remember being 6 years old, don't know nothing about being queer, saying, you love who you love. My baby sister, Gwen, who you know, tells the story of, she was like, you always said that. Like, I've always said that. So, and I grew up in a holiness tradition, and my father, I never heard my father preach a sermon about gay folk. Now, that don't mean my father didn't have some bad theology about it. He just never spent any time. So I didn't have to deconstruct it on that level. You know what I'm saying? But I do think people have to deconstruct some stuff that has lived with them for years.
Oh, can I share something
anybody's pulpit?
Say that again, Bishop. I share something with you that so powerfully, to just how powerfully that touches me deeply, what you just said. And Mama, when you knew Mama, my mother was actively dying with cancer. And the same time that Shirley, my spouse, was diagnosed with cancer. And I was going across the Golden Gate Bridge from one hospital to the other, see Mama in South San Francisco, and come back to Marin, where we lived, to take Shirley to the doctor. And in between those realities, I had a break, an emotional break on the bridge that made me hit my steering wheel. And I got into an argument with God. It's, what in the world is this about? This is just really my loves. I mean, let's talk about, this can't be happening, right? And I remember how anguished I was. And just behind that anguish came a voice that said, well, if you were not doing this stuff that you are doing, if you had not essentially allowed yourself to be a same gender loving woman, essentially, then these things would not have happened. Something from my real long ago past caught me at probably the single weakest moment of my life with a whole bucket of condemnation. And for a minute, I was shocked because I did not know. I'd written books, you know me, I've been preaching. I had raised up a church. And I could not believe that was really still in the back of my consciousness. And
Right.
it came to the front in my despair.
Right.
And I said to God, I said, oh no, not this, not here, not now. And I heard what I believed to be the voice of the divine. It said two things to me. First of all, this is the last time in your life that you will ever have this consideration. Number one. The second thing, I will get the glory out of both of these experiences.
Wow.
I repented. I literally repented to our God and said, forgive me for ever doubting your call on my life. And I declare I will never revisit this ever again. The last time I hear you saying it's the last time, I'm saying it's the last time. My mother passed away in December of that year. If you can remember, was our year we were in Chicago.
Right.
My mother had stage 4 lung cancer. She asked to die without pain. She asked to die quickly. God gave her both. Shirley had stage 4 breast cancer. She completely, hallelujah, glory to God, was completely healed and has never had, she had a lumpectomy and the lump had not moved to any of her immune system at all. It was an amazing miracle. Both of them experienced a miracle, but so did Yvette that day on the freeway. And that's the last time that I had that experience. I want to put that out there and say it to my beloved today, that our certainty is what makes our witness powerful. Preach, sisters, preach, teach, affirm, confirm the who you are, because God knew who you were when God called you.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you one last question before we switch, which is how do help this group of people who are listening in on us. I told Sean and Janet to act like they're listening to grandmama's talking. So we're women of a certain age. So
yes.
Help these people who want to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic.
Yes.
Help them construct a sermon right now. You do that. I like to just boil the water. But
yeah, just boil the water is a good sermon. But I also think that it is important to understand that we are living on the planet not to remain here forever. We didn't come here to, we'd like to, at least we think we would, but we didn't come here to remain here forever. Sickness, disease, or death are not an enemy to us. Because one of my associate pastors said, Jesus did something about death when it was a problem. It is no longer a problem. What we want to do is live our best lives, because what we want to do is serve God with our best lives. That's what we want to do. But God did not give us a spirit of fear, but power and love and a sound mind. And so I would say to people in this time, in this epidemic, preach about the fact that there have been many before it. Lifespans are longer than they ever were before. We have longer opportunities to serve, but there is a vacation. There is a glory. There is something that comes after this. And as my mama used to say all the time, she said, everybody talking about heaven, 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 heaven. Woo, I want to go streets paved with gold, where you never grow old till it's time to go. We cannot lose, beloved. If we live, we win. When we die, we win. So what we want to do is do our assignment. What is your assignment? And your assignment is not to grieve the fact that you are going to move from life to life. Anybody understand what I'm saying, right? Our assignment is to do what we were placed in the earth realm to do. So when the time comes, we move, we're marching, I like that, to Zion. beautiful, the beautiful city of God. That is what I preach to myself all the time. Up near about 70. You know what I'm saying? I'm kissing 70s behind.
Yeah, we're women of a certain age.
Hallelujah. I'm a woman of a certain age. I'm getting there, cheering. I was going
Yeah.
to on my way. But I want to go out of here with victory.
Right.
Death, where's your sting?
Right.
And grave, where's your victory?
Right. I think if I were gonna craft a sermon that was shaping the community of faith, and now I'm thinking about cishet folk, right, who have to figure out how to actually be community, how to actually be the people of God. I'm like, I don't know how you know that the whole law and prophets land on two things: love God with your whole mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And if you hate anybody, that means you hate yourself, because you connected to everybody. So figure out how you're gonna love yourself so you can love the folk God loves, because God loves everybody. That's how you do that. So yeah. Okay, so that's our volley. Tierney, if you're going to bring in Dion now before we go to our panelists, here's the time to do it, and we'll be back with our panelists. And I've asked our panelists, Janet and Sean, to introduce themselves. So I don't think Janet or Sean that I'm going to come back in to do after Dion until we all four are talking. Thank you, Bishop, so far.
My joy.
My God, today. My God, today. I mean, I'm still on our certainty is what makes our witness powerful, because God knew who you were when God called you. My God. Thank you, Bishop. Thank you, Dr. Bridgman. I am Reverend Dion Boissier, proud new chair of Women Preachers Board. And this is the second series of 3 conversations on preaching from the margins. If y'all were here, the first one, this right here, the second one is giving us so much life. We are going to serve God with our best lives, Bishop. That's the word that you have given us to continue with our assignment. And in this special season of thanks and giving, it is our assignment to continue to have this work go on. Funding this work, some people think because you were able to log on today without having to pay a fee, was able to, registration cost, there was none. People think that we've got these big funders behind us, but that is not the case. It's only possibly because of you, because of the work, because you come alongside of us. You are Women Preach Nation. And so I want to ask you if you might consider joining us in the assignment of keeping Women Preach moving on. If you were a monthly donor like me, even if you're a one-time donor, we're grateful for you, but we need to make sure the work continues and that it continues at a low cost. So would you join me today in giving? And there's so many various ways that you can give. I know you've seen it before, but join me in giving on Givelify, on Cash App, on PayPal, but whatever vehicle it is, we want to say thank you to you. So don't forget to put your email address in there. Don't forget to let us know if your email is incorrect on your PayPal. We may not be able to get to you, but give us your email addresses so we can keep you connected, keep you updated on the work, and keep you joining us in our assignment. Now, so before we go to Q&A, I just want to ask you, today is Thursday, right? And usually we do a throwback Thursday. Would you join me in the chat? If Woman Preach has ever blessed your life, ever, if you've ever given one time or your monthly, let us know in the chat. Do you remember when you fell in love with Woman Preach? Let us know. Let us know in the chat right there. And then don't forget to give. Women Preach Nation, we need you so that we can keep this work going. That's our assignment. We're going to keep doing it to serve God with our best lives. Join me today. Yes, let me see you in the chat if you're a monthly giver like me, or if the one time. And again, Givelify, Cash App, PayPal, whatever vehicle you choose, please let us say thank you to you. Join us in the season of thanks and giving. We're so grateful for you being an active supporter with us, because you keep Woman Preach doing things like tonight. You keep Woman Preach alive, and because of you, we can keep on going. Ashe and amen.
You're on, Janet.
Perfect. Well, thank you. I am on assignment and I'm filled with purpose. So thank you for a few minutes. My name is Dr. Janet Cordovez. I serve as the Director of Higher Ed Partnerships at Interfaith Youth Corps. And it was such a blessing to be in the living room with two grandmas and listening to your stories and gaining wisdom. And it's also such a blessing to have intergenerational conversations so that we can learn from one another and really be a force to be reckoned with. So I'm just so grateful for the invitation to be with you and to just share a few words and things that are resonating with me. So as I mentioned, I work at Interfaith Youth Corps, and it's IFYC, and it's a national nonprofit that equips the next generation of citizens and professionals with the knowledge and skills to engage across lines of religious difference. We partner with higher education and corporations, and we're just dedicated to creating a world where interfaith cooperation is the norm and building an interfaith America for the 21st century. Things that resonated with me from what you both shared was this thing that there's so many that hold on to this idea that we have an angry God. And because of that, we blame the person and they are responsible and not the disease. And today, we're at 40 years of HIV and AIDS diagnosis here in the US. And yet this ideology is still prevalent. It still prevails. And it's also why IFYC is partnering with Wake Forest Divinity School and Gilead Sciences. Because according to recent CDC data, and the epicenter of the epidemic has moved from cities like New York and Los Angeles to the American South. And although I think it's 38% of the US population lives in the American South, approximately 51% of new cases originate in the southern states. Of those, Black, Latinx communities account for the majority of those new diagnoses. So recognizing the critical importance and wanting to address and trying to address this health crisis head on, IFYC has partnered with Gilead Compass Initiative and Wake Forest Divinity School to address the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS, which is a barrier. When Bishop Flinders said, if they only knew, we wouldn't have to dehumanize or vilify the people, I thought, but we know now, and still we stigma is one of the largest barriers, and still we dehumanize, and still we are limited in our thinking. We started way too late thinking that it was an equal opportunist a disease. It was too late when we recognized that it affected everyone. And I think our work as Christians is to help people not die, as you said, but to provide care and love and comfort. This is what we're called to do. This is how we walk our faith. We live out our faith. And I think that it's sinful to think that we know God's purposes. We are beautiful and unique, but we are not God. We are limited. And I think thinking that you're omniscient or know is destructive and arrogant and independent of God, which is not what we are called to be as people of faith. We are called to be dependent on God. Being hated by the outgroup is also shared, and so we are humanized. But it's like was said in the conversation, we enslave ourselves. So there's the external stigma of the outgroup, but then the in-group, the internal stigma, and that has you thinking that because you're living with HIV and AIDS, perhaps you're not worthy of love or care or friends, but this is not the case. God loves you. And I encourage you from Ephesians, we must stay our guard, stay in the word, strengthen and be dressed with our armor, because people will say hurtful things. and people will say things over and over again, and that's one element, but then you will internalize them. So stay in the word and stay dressed in your armor. Therefore, take up the full armor of God, pray in the Spirit at all times with every kind of prayer and petition. To this end, stay alert with all perseverance in your prayers for all the saints. We are working for eternity, as we're just talking about at the end. But we keep thinking of heaven. We're working for eternity, but we're here. We're in this world. So what is your assignment? What is your purpose? And let's get to work. As was also shared in pressure or depression and agony, we have a tendency of getting smaller and having doubts. And Bishop Flender shared that she had a revelation, and it was two things that came through, right? This is the last time that you will have this consideration, that you will have this doubt. And the second, that I, God, will have this glory. So I leave you with be strong and of good courage. Do not fear, nor be afraid of them or anyone who is alienating or ostracizing. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Thank you so much for having me be a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Janet. That was so important to hear. You on, Sean?
Good evening, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Women Preach and Dr. Valerie Bridgman, the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, and Bishop Yvette Flender for allowing me to be in this space. I am not a person who identifies as a woman. However, I am grateful to be here. My name is Sean Torres Anderson. I am a Philly native. I am an HBCU grad. I am a Union Theological Seminary grad. I am also the Associate Pastor of Operations at Bethany Baptist Church, which is this symbol right here, located in Newark, New Jersey. And I ought to say that so I can continue being the Associate Pastor of Operations at Bethany Baptist Church. But I am also a person who is living with HIV, and I have been for the last 13 years. So it is great to be here and be a part of this conversation. And I'm grateful for what we have heard thus far, because a lot of what we heard so far is some of the concepts and ideas that I've been wrestling with. And the first thing that I want to talk about is, I think Dr. Bridgman asked, help folks construct a sermon that affirms people living with HIV and AIDS right now. And I heard this idea of deconstruction. First of all, we have to deconstruct what we know before we can create sermons that affirm folks, right? A lot of our theology around wellness and healing is often projected as only being available to us after we are dead, right? And we say this, like I've been a part of large churches, and we have funerals sometimes 3 times a week. So 3 times a week, I hear things like, oh, they've received their ultimate healing. Oh, there's a place where no more sickness and no more death. But I think my question is, what do we do with our bodies while we are here, right? And a lot of that theology that we talk about heaven, and I love heaven and I want to go there. However, I don't want to go there right now, right? So why I am here, what theologies are we preaching that allows folks to love their bodies, to take care of their bodies, and to not decompartmentalize parts of their bodies, not hide certain parts of their bodies? How do we create theologies that tells folk that, you can love your body, and that includes taking your medication. That includes taking medications that will stop the transmission of HIV. All of that is a part of loving our bodies. We demonize medication, and we demonize like mental health services all the time. We need to start affirming those things, as these are a part of life. Taking medication is a part of life. And then HIV is really one of those only diseases that we think is God's punishment, right? When I was 12 years old, I heard that, my punishment for queer sexuality would be HIV, right? And this was from somebody that I knew and loved, and it's because of proximity, right? Those are the folks that I have closest to me. However, that's a symptom of a larger problem. Jerry Falwell started, preaching that gospel 30, 40 years ago, that because God does not love LGBTQ folks, that our punishment, or that God's punishment, would be HIV, right? And not just for LGBTQ folks, but those who tolerate LGBTQ folks, right? That's the hill that he decided to die on. And that's the theology that has been passed down from years to years. And if I'm being honest, my mother doesn't know Jerry Falwell or any of my other family members who, said things about, or any of the pastors that I've heard say that your, queer sexuality will be punished for HIV with HIV. They don't know who Jerry Falwell is, right? This is a theology that has been passed down because it's easy to pass this type of harmful, violent rhetoric down. It's harder to pass down a theology that says that God loves you, right? We place so much restriction on that type of theology, an affirming theology, and a theology about a loving God. However, that should be the easy thing that falls off of our tongues. And I'm thinking about this idea that our certainty is what makes our witness powerful. I love that, Bishop Flender. As a person who always knew that I was called by God, parts of myself started to doubt that because of the things that I internalized, and Reverend McNair talked about that as well, right? And it's a part of that deconstruction, right? Me as a preacher did not believe that I was loved by God because I heard so many things from pastors and from family members that said, because of your sexuality, because of you living with HIV, that God doesn't love you, right? And this idea that our health status is because we didn't love God enough, or we didn't walk in God's ways enough, or we didn't align ourselves with God's will enough, right? This is where a lot of that harmful theology comes from as it relates to someone's health status, right? But that again, we are not enemies to like sickness, or like those things happen, right? And it's not because God wants to punish me for my queer sexuality that I'm living with HIV. There are environmental issues that exist. There are social determinants of health that exist that makes it easier for someone like me, who is Black, who grew up in poverty, who did not have access to equitable health care, that would make it easier for me to contract or seroconvert, right? And it would make it easier for most of us who are Black and or queer and or poor and grew up in the hood, right? It makes it easier for us. That's why, Black men who have sex with other men are 1 and 2 times more likely, or will, the CDC says, if you're a Black man who has sex with other Black men, you will be diagnosed with HIV in your lifetime, 50% of us. And when we're thinking about white gay men, right, it's 1 out of 11 of them, right? So the disproportionate impacts exist. When we're thinking about Black women, is 1 out of, I think, 38 or 27. And then when it's white women, it's 1 out of like 94, right? So, and it's not because we are having different types of sex than white people. It's because of the conditions that exist within our environments that would allow us to be susceptible to these types of diseases. And it's not just HIV, it's high blood pressure, it's asthma, it's all of those things that would make it easier for Black and brown folks to live with those diseases. And it's not because we serve an angry or miserable God. It's because we live in a society that just doesn't honor Black and brown people, and doesn't put things in place that would protect our health. This has nothing to do with God, and everything to do with the fact that Black and brown people are not loved enough in this country. And I'll stop there.
Sir, okay, Tierney, go ahead and pin the 4 of us for this conversation. And let me just thank Janet and Sean for what you have said thus far. Just say, dear God. I will say, Sean, that that Woman Preach has offerings for men and male identified people and gender non-conforming people. So you got invited because I knew what you was gonna say. So there you go.
Thank you,
because I
man.
know you. And actually, I'm not the one that brought your name up. How about that? Somebody else actually
That's good.
brought your name up, and I was like, yeah, Sean, that one. So
Beautiful.
let me just say, as we kind of respond to what we've heard, Bishop, and as you get ready, we have about 25, 30 more minutes. If you're attending and you have a question, put it in the Q&A, not the chat, because we're not going to be checking for questions in the Q&A, but in the chat. But if you have a question, ask it in the Q&A. And just to remind you, we're still taking donations. Thank you for those of you who've already donated. And if you make a donation and you forgot to put your email in your donation, if you gave through Cash App or someplace else, just send an email to give@womanpreach, not women, womanpreach.org. It comes from Preach, Woman Preach. Just send us an email so we will have your email. We'll know you gave, and we'll be able to appropriately thank you for your gift. Thank you for those of you who have already given and who plan to keep on giving. So thank you. Bishop, you heard from the youngins that was sitting around listening to the table. What you got to say?
I have great hope. I felt absolutely preached to in just a few minutes, and given incredibly wonderful, cogent, clear information about what is happening, and moving away from the binary. If there was anything in the world that I heard and feel in my heart is incredibly important in this time, is moving away from gluing people to either or. It's not the way God works, and it is not the way humans work. It is not the way countries work, and it is certainly not the intention of the divine, which is the sickness about religion. Either or. You're in or you're out. And you're in only if you're in with what we say is in. Okay, if you're not, you're out. And even kindly, we do it kindly at the annual multi-faith service. You know what I'm talking about? Where we get together and we kindly endure one another's understandings of the divine, thinking to ourselves, if this could just be over in about 20 minutes so I can get back with the people who really know God in a real way, right? I'll just deal with it for a little while. I'll be nice, nasty, as I call it. I'll just deal with it for a little while. That is because we have to remove these binary concepts of religion, of race, of sexuality. What is the extent of wealth? What does wealth mean? Essentially, there are so many pieces of this, and you all walked all over that today. And I want to say thank you very much. You give me hope for my future.
Yeah, I was struck, by what both of you said. I guess I want, Sean, I really appreciate what you said about knowing your call. And I think this is one of the issues, people who are queer and called, and they're not willing to back up off of that part, but then have to figure out how to live in the hostile environment that the church often is. Not all churches, and I mean to say not all churches, because I also don't want to make some claim that's not true, that churches are, quote, like this. All churches are like this, because you got representatives here that isn't true. So when you, and Janet, I have a question for you too. When you said I was clear about my call, and how do you shape a sermon that is clear about the call, without, I don't even know that I want to go with the without that's in my head. So that, and I'm going to say this to Janet while you're thinking. Janet, you gave us some stats that 38% of people live in the South, and yet 51% of the new diagnoses are in the South. And I want you to reflect a little bit more on how that's tied to what we're talking about. So Sean, then Janet.
So thank you so much for your for that question. There are a lot of us who are queer and called who, are in hostile environments, right? That's why we see queer folks and we talk about it, that's a church hopper. They don't, right? No, we move because of the hostile environment that we're in, right? It's not that queer folks don't want to keep switching churches every other day, right? Every other week, every month, every year. We don't want to do that. We want to stay in a space that's loving, because what happens is churches present themselves as affirming spaces, but they're not actually accessible spaces, right? All churches are affirming. All churches would allow queer folks to come in, but not every church will be accessible, allowing queer folks to access or to access ordained ministry. All churches will not allow queer folks to access the right to have their children confirmed or blessed or baptized there, right? All churches are affirming. Every church will allow queer folks to come in and just sit, but not every church would allow queer folks to access the rights and the rituals that all folks are afforded, right? When I got my new members certificate from the first church that I attended in seminary, it says, Sean Torres, a member of said church with all the rights and privileges afforded to them. That's what the certificate said. However, that's not what was happening, and that wasn't the reality. As soon as I told the pastor that I was living with HIV, he removed me from the pulpit. And I didn't tell him that I was queer. I just told him I was living with HIV. So he conflated an HIV status with a queer sexuality, right? And that was okay, whatever. However, I was welcome. The church was affirming to me, but it didn't allow me to access the same rights and privileges that the church gave me when I became a new member of that church. So I think that's something that, not all churches are affirming, but not all churches are accessible.
That's good. It's like being black in the balcony.
Yeah.
Yes.
And also, I don't know that I agree with you that all churches are affirming, because I done heard some horrible sermons about people saying, I'll throw you out if I find out that you gay.
But they're there. I think the thing for me is that they're, and those theologies are being preached while queer folks are there and have to hide themselves and then walk out of the sanctuary shamed.
Yeah, that's why I said I don't know that I would agree with affirming. They are open to you being in their space, but they ain't affirming, and they're not safe.
Maybe I should say welcoming. All churches are welcoming. Maybe I should say that, right?
And can I just say too, that is conditional.
Right.
Understand that the roles a lot of time of gay folks in the church is music, the music department, the musicians, the ones who dress the first lady, the ones who cook, the ones who paint, the ones with color and panache. So there's a conditional affirmation that says, keep your gay down, keep that gay down, and do the stuff that we need you to do.
Right.
In your school, if you understand what I'm saying. So it's something in the middle, sort of,
Janet, I asked you a question. Then we got questions in the chat that I'm going to bring up.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about Reverend Sean's responses to the systemic issues as we think about the CDC stats, and specifically in the South. I mean, you think about one is the stigma. Even right now, in the example that was just shared, like you can't be your full self, or you're welcome, but as long as it's secretive, right? And so once you receive perhaps a HIV positive diagnosis, you don't want anyone in your home to know, but there's mail that needs to come to your home. So then you decide that you're not going to get mail at home. So then you don't have a follow-up appointment. Then when the appointment comes, do you choose to go to work, or do you choose to go to the multiple appointments, right? There's the systemic of like access, communication, but that it's all really wrapped around in the stigma. If your community that you're a part of doesn't fully accept you, that could be your family and likely your church, very often your church community, especially as we talk about the South, then then you're not having access to public health, and you're not meeting your doctor's appointments, and you're not going to your follow-up. And for so many of the medications, you need a refrigerator. And can you keep your medication in a community refrigerator? Or if you have, instability within your housing arrangement, are you able to leave that in the common space? And so all these barriers, as Sean was sharing in some of his examples, Reverend Sean in his examples, really increase and make the epicenter has moved and relocated to the southern US.
Thank you. I'm going to the questions. I'm gonna answer the last question first and then go back to the top. The question is, when we say preaching from the margins, is this limited to those from the LGBTQIA community? Because it is my understanding that it is not exclusive to sexuality. You're right, it's not, but that's tonight's conversation. We're doing 3-part conversations on speaking from the margins, and this one happens to be in honor of HIV/AIDS Day that was yesterday. So that's the answer to that. What kind of support should the ally provide to the LGBTQIA community? I'm surely an ally. Joanne says, Joanne Matthews, she's given her name. What kind of support should the ally give? So let me just say this, and this is going to sound horrible, Joanne, but take it really with love, because I have come to despise the word ally. It's not because I don't think they are allies. It's because the word ally comes out of military, where it's what's in it for me, ally, in the military term. And I want collaborators and co-conspirators. If you don't understand that your survival is tied up in my survival, not, you're coming alongside, kind of as a good person to make sure. Now, I'm not saying you're saying this, Joanne. I'm explaining why I'm putting the word ally down. So I'm gonna let everybody else answer it, but I'm explaining why I'm putting it down. Because I think about Cherie Morega, who said, if you don't understand that your freedom is tied to my freedom, to use Fannie Hamer's famous words, ain't none of us free till all of us free. Ain't none of us whole until all of us whole. That's why I'm going to take it that you're a collaborator and a co-conspirator. Everybody speak now. I'm done.
Yeah. And also, I like that idea of co-conspirator, because we need folks who want to disrupt the status quo with us, right?
Exactly.
And use your resources to do that, right?
And use your resources.
To do that, right? When our queer brothers and sisters, I think in the United Methodist Church, were going up at their annual conference, about affirming, queer clergy members, right? There were folk who said, "Oh, we support them," and did nothing. All they said was, "We support them." A Facebook post is not you being a co-conspirator. A Facebook post knows that you know what's happening, but until you use your resources to then co-collaborate with us or collaborate with us, then you become an ally or a co-conspirator. Use those resources that you have. If it's your church as a resource, use that. If it's your money as a resource, use that. But resource is something that's tangible.
Yeah, use your power for good.
Use your power for good.
Use your power and privilege for good. So
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that as a disruptor, co-conspirator, take the back seat, right? And so allow individuals that are living with HIV and AIDS, allow LGBTQI plus individuals to lead, and that you stand beside them. But the stage is not yours. And so give the power and give it away.
There's one other thing I'd also like to add, and that is I watched the recent Black Lives Matter marches that you all know what I'm talking about, where the kids were in the street for just days on end, from city to city and country to country, situation to situation. And I saw something I've never seen in any of the marches that I have known down through the years. I'm old enough to have been in lots of different marches, but I saw them. Some of the children were white identified children, young people who got in the way of rubber bullets and gas. for and on behalf of young people of color. I watched that happen again and again and again and again. And I have to say that this is the first time I have ever had an experience that had that many people putting themselves in real, honest to goodness harm's way, not just playing like it, but I mean showing up. And it reminds me of the early AIDS days where we laid down in coffins in the middle of the street and stopped traffic
Right.
to get people's attention. And we weren't living with HIV. We were there on behalf of people who were living in HIV, but we put ourselves, I believe you when you put some skin in the game. I believe you when you really do put yourself in harm's way, and in the same ways that those of us who live in harm's way every day, no matter what it is that we do, we are in harm's way. Then I believe that we really have a coalition. So perhaps that's my amen to most of what I've heard.
Bishop, I'm going to direct this question at you. I have an answer to this too, but you know me. I'm gonna try. You sweeter about this than I am. Is it possible to preach a gospel that affirms God's love for everyone, even if you have not yet embraced the idea of same gender loving relationships are sanctioned by God? What do we do with such scriptures in Romans 1 and such? You know, I got an answer, but I'm gonna let you go first.
It would be the same thing as a person who is a kind slaveholder. I see it the same way, because during the time of chattel slavery in this country, there were kind slaveholders who basically took it in their minds that slavery was something that was ordained by God. It's definitely affirmed in several places in the text. Without question, it's there over and over and over again. And literal reading of the text was on the side of the slave holders, not the ones who were the abolitionists. And that is absolutely the truth. I still don't preach from the Book of Philemon. I just wanted to kind of put that out there. But simultaneously, nice is still nasty when it is in some way attacking the rights of other people.
Right.
And so even if you're a kind, tolerant person who has an issue with same gender loving people in terms of how same gender loving people stand before their understanding of the divine, here is your task. Do the work that you need to do to understand the science, the realities, the humanity of a non-binary God. Do your work. If you are still thinking that way, you have not done your work. I'm a Black woman raised in the Pentecostal church. I told you I clap on the 2 and the 4. And when I hear people clapping on the 1 and the 3, it disturbs my spirit. But I do understand that some people clap on the 1 and the 3. Do you understand? So it disturbs, but I know that it is not a sin to clap on the 1 and the 3. It just disturbs me because inside of me, the first beat belongs to God and the second beat belongs to me. That's the way I was raised. Do your work. Do your work. And don't tell me you have done your work. You believe in biblical marriage? No, you don't.
Don't.
So do your work.
Because you don't believe in rape marriage. You don't believe that, people have the right to go into a neighborhood and grab daughters and wives of other people's and rape them and marry them. You don't believe that.
You don't believe that.
That's biblical marriage.
You
That's
don't believe
literally
that.
biblical marriage. You don't believe
You don't
that.
believe that.
You
don't
know,
believe that one race of people is more important to God than any other race. These are the people of God and everybody else is grafted in. You don't believe that. And if you don't believe that, then do your work on human sexuality.
So one of my ways of answering this question is the Bible is at its best a conversation partner. And those of us who claim to love God and are not having a conversation with the Bible, we're lying to ourselves, because the truth of the matter is, I think there's something like 3,000 texts on how to treat people who we've made poor. And we don't talk about those texts. we talk about the 6 texts, maybe 6 texts that have to do with same gender sex. It ain't even same gender loving, same gender sex. And we don't talk about those texts where, like the centurion whose Pedon is probably his lover. We don't talk about the relationship of when David says his love for y'all help me, is greater than any love he
For
ever had
Jonathan.
for a
Love for
woman.
Jonathan.
For Jonathan.
Than he had for any woman, and yet he had several women. We don't talk about that. So the truth of the matter is, we're not trying to read the Bible critically. We're just repeating what somebody said to us, that this is what Paul meant by Romans 1. Now, let me just say this about Romans 1, and I'll let that I'll let this go, which is to say that Paul is actually quoting somebody else. And if you read Romans 1, actually read Romans 1, you'll find out that he is arguing that anybody who defaces who they are before God is a brute somebody. So if you're asking people who are same gender loving to deface themselves and to deny themselves, then you're asking them not to love who God loves. That's my answer. Okay.
Can I add something? The
Yes,
other thing is, the Bible was never meant to be read alone, right?
exactly.
Read the Bible by ourselves. This is a communal work. We're supposed to be reading this together in community with one another. And the other part of this is, we made sermon writing so self-centric. You also can write your sermon in community with other people. We ought to have somebody who is, if we can't do it ourselves, who is reading our sermons, who is proofreading our sermons, who is saying, sis, that ain't it, bro, that ain't it, rework this, read that again. Here's a text you can use to support your argument. All of this is not supposed to be done by ourselves. We're supposed to be doing this together. That's what community is. That's what the church is a group of people coming together to worship God. And that also includes the sermon writing process, because most of the time, what you read is not what the text is actually saying.
Right.
And you have to do a little deeper digging to get to what the text not just said, but what the text is saying. So that's my answer to that.
Right.
That was
Woman preach way.
Yeah, the woman preach way. Yeah, you interrogate the text, but you also interrogate the context. And I'm gonna go back to, who God shows up, how God shows. I watch people respond to Bishop Flunder and then to her preaching, and then walk away and go, oh, but she's gay, but she's gay. But she's gay. They know they just had an encounter with God. No, they just had an encounter, but she's gay, but she's gay, she's gay. Like, really? You want to torture yourself from the truth? Go for it. Okay. How can we support those who are gay and queer and called into a hostile environment? Should we just encourage them to move to a place of accessibility or fight for the accessibility? So anybody want to answer that?
I remember a friend of mine who is a Pentecostal preacher. And I posted about this on Facebook a few years ago. He's a Pentecostal preacher who wanted to pastor. And he asked me about Baptist churches, because I'm a Baptist preacher, who were hiring. And I said, look in your own denomination. He says, well, we don't have openings like that. I said, well, I can't help you with that. And then I said, start your own church, right? Do that. And his response to me was like, and I think my response to him was, I can't help you because I'm a Baptist preacher, and I'm upset about how many Pentecostal folks can come over to the Baptist church and occupy our pulpits. However, I am a licensed and ordained Baptist preacher and had been for over 10 years, and I can't get to the pulpits. And his response to me was, start your own church. And my response to him was, you can also start your own church, right? It's not cheap starting a church. And I've never started a church before, and I know it ain't cheap. However, and I think this is a part of my tension with, cishet folks, is they want us to start our own things when there are spaces carved out for us that people will love for us to come and be their pastors, right? So what I'm saying is, you have to allow, queer folks in hostile environments to make that decision for themselves, if they want to stay or if they want to go, and you support them either way, right? And another thing is, when you know that there's a queer person who has their license or their ordination revoked, what are you going to do with yours, right? Are you going to say, I stand with this person, so I'm giving mine because you wouldn't allow them to keep theirs? And that's a hard ask and sometimes a hard sell. But again, as Bishop Flunder says, if you're not throwing your skin in the game, then I don't believe you, then I don't trust you.
Can I say something about prophetic ministry just for a minute? And tell you what one of the old missionaries from the Pentecostal church who came to us, I guess it's been Mother Stanton sitting here next to me, Mother Miller, my spouse.
Hey, Mother Shirley.
Please, I get her to say hi. There she go. 37 years we've been together. And let me say that when she came to my church and she said to me, she said, Pastor Flunder, she said it just like that. She said, you're not going to get yours the way a whole lot of other folks got theirs. That's the way she said it to me. It was her way of saying that what we were called to was a prophetic ministry. And the first thing we had to be prepared for is not to go down the beaten path. We had to get Scott's concept of the road less traveled. The road less traveled. That is the prophetic, that is the way for the prophetic people to hear what is the voice of God that is not the common method, the typical way. I could not get a denomination to finance what it is that was our dream and vision. But I can say to you, I have buried many a person who said we would fail. I didn't kill them. I don't want you to hear me say that. But I have presided over their funerals. You need to hear me say that. When they said that we would fail in 2 months, in 3 months, in 6 months, that was 30 years ago. But I can also say to you that we took the road less traveled. And maybe the next time we talk, Dr. Bridgman, we can start talking about ways to succeed in ministry that are so different from the roads that we've been told that we must go down. That is a part of the issue.
Well, we can definitely do that in February when we talk, just letting all y'all know we're going to do this again in February because we're going to be focusing on Jarena Lee and her iconic ministry. And that is definitely a road less traveled story as we talk about how do you do the work of ministry? How do you support? The question about how do you support people, it's real. And I do think it goes back to how do you come to believe that God actually loves you? And the you in this sentence is you, uniquely you. And here, I don't care how you identify, what your intersectionalities are. Queer, woman, Black, Latina, Latinx, rich, not rich, whatever. At the level of where you live, can you believe that God loves you? At the level of where you live, at your address, and I mean your emotional, physical, spiritual address. Can you believe that? And you might have to be saying, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. I mean, that may be where you are. Someone asked this question, then I'm gonna let everybody have their last words here because we're running out of time. Oh my Lord. I heard someone say, use your power and privilege for good. The someone was me. But overall, we don't really teach that as people of color, we are privileged. How do we reconcile that? What is the privilege of which you speak that we have in order to help? So since I said it, I'm going to start with an answer, but I do invite all of you to answer. This goes back to what Bishop Flunder said about the enslaved people. You know, there were some folk who knew that slavery was wrong, period. And they never bought into their, I'm using this in quotation marks, lack of privilege. Here's what I know. because we bear the image of God. All of us have some privilege somewhere. All of us have some power somewhere because we serve a God of power. And it becomes our job to know what our tools are, to know what we have in our hand. You know, I can hear God saying to Moses, I can hear the Spirit saying to Moses, what's in your hand? You know, so if sometimes we use our so-called, and I do mean so-called, lack of privilege as an excuse not to do anything or to cover up our inaction, our whatever it is. But nobody's asking you to go do all the work. Sometimes, I don't know if you, now, I grew up in the country. So if you've ever seen ants in a flood, they connect themselves to each other. And they all get out alive because they connect themselves to each other. The work we have to do is to put, is coalition building, put our power together. And what looks like little becomes much because it becomes a part of what everybody else is bringing. So the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, the 2 fish and the loaves of bread, I love the notion that he wasn't the only one with a meal out there. But imagine he brought his out, Jesus blessed and broke that, and other folks started saying, yeah, I guess I can share this sandwich too. I mean, there's a miracle in that too. Okay, y'all.
I'm with you, Dr. Bridgman. These systems of privilege and oppression, they exist and we navigate them daily, hourly. And we serve an all-powerful God, a God that provides strength and courage and boldness. And so as I'm not a pastor, but I did have to navigate academia, right? I'm an immigrant, I'm a Latinx, I'm a first gen, I'm figuring all this stuff out, right? So I could use that, all those identities as places of oppression, and they were hard and they were difficult. And I dealt with racism and I dealt with these systems and, was told multiple times, you cannot pursue your PhD, you cannot study STEM, right? All these things, or as a woman, or as this, or as that, those things came up. And I chose to stay in the word, to use those things that were told to me were deficits as assets to bring my community along, to be a translator, to be in the community, to talk about recently HIV and AIDS, to talk about COVID-19 pandemic, because I am trusted in that space. I have the credentials, and now it's a place of power. And I think that happens quite often where, my teachers would really give me poor marks because I was handling 3 languages, and now they're assets. And so I think you have to be really careful about what you let this world tell you is and what our God tells us we are and what we are called to be.
Thank you, Janet. Sean and Bishop, I'm going to let you close us out before I say my last word. Or maybe I'm gonna let Sean speak. I'm gonna say my last word, and then Bishop gonna close us out. So y'all don't leave before Bishop closes us out.
All of us have a certain level of privilege, right? Not all of us have equal amounts of privilege or equal access to certain privileges. As a Black cisgender male, I have certain levels of privileges as being male, as being trans, or as being cisgender, right? When I'm and I'm going to connect this to HIV. I also work in public health and have been working in public health for the last 10 years. And I've been working in capacity building, where we provide capacity building services to local HIV and AIDS organizations. We do trainings for them. And when we're thinking about HIV and AIDS, we're thinking about the data that exists. So Dr. Janet and I talked about data that relates to people that live in the South, data that relates to, Black MSM, data that relates to, Black women and white white men. There is no data that exists for Black transgender people as it relates to HIV and AIDS. And that is because there are some folks who have certain levels of privileges do not think that we ought to have data for trans folks because they're still seeing transgender people through the eyes of through the eyes or through the lens of them being Black men, right? And that's because there are some folks who are using their privileges in perverted ways. There are ways you can use your privilege in ways that helps and does not harm, ways you can use your privilege that affirms and does not cast folks away. There are ways we can use privileges. So myself, as a Black cisgender male, I use my privilege in a way that uplifts and supports transgender folks, that it supports and uplifts Black women in certain spaces, right? So we can use our privilege no matter what levels of privileges we have. If you're a white person, you have privilege. You can get on TV and cry and get out of being convicted for killing two people, right? There are certain levels of privileges that certain people have, and you ought to use those in ways that affirms people and not in ways that you can pervert that privilege that you have.
Thank you. As Bishop comes to say the last word and give us a final prayer, I just want to invite you again to give. Tierney's going to put the giving information in the chat again, and remind you that if your name is not in your PayPal, right, or if you have the wrong email in there, please send us your email so that we can thank you appropriately. Thank you so much for being here with us. We could obviously go on for another hour because I love these conversation partners. So thank you, Janet and Sean, for being with us today. This has been such a gift to me and to Woman Preach Nation. You are now officially a part of Woman Preach Nation because you showed up. All right, Bishop, take us out.
This was great. This was absolutely wonderful and very, I believe, indicative of the work of the Spirit in the time in which we live. In the COVID, we are finding our ways to each other in unique and powerful ways. And I wish Tony McNeil was here with his keyboard. I know he's with us. But I thought about something, Tony, when we were talking. It's good for me in the closing of what we are doing. And this question of marginalization and how do we prepare for what it is that we are called to do? I encourage you to have intimacy with the divine. Find a place to go where you can spend some time in conversation and presence and power and prayer with your understanding of the divine, because that is what will strengthen us for the times that we are in and for the times that are to come. And the old folks used to say, and he walks with me and talks with me. I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the child, the Son of God, discloses. And I can hear the old saints say, in my room, that's what they used to say, God gives me all my medicines, writes out all my scriptures. That's what they used to say. In my room. I want to say to you, intimacy with your understanding of the divine is critical, because that's our armor when we come back out into the place that seeks to diminish us and to destroy us and confront us with the binary concepts of this or that, or this or that. It is in that moment that you reach down into your own soul and put your hand on your understanding of God and just let the people talk. And when the time comes, like my grandma used to do, she used to pin her money inside her bra. Yours may not have done that, and people, she said, could steal my purse, but I still won't be poor. I need you to hear me. I need you to hear me today, because it was pinned to the inside of her bra. And when spending time came, she knew how to go where her money was and pull it out. So if you were here, Tony, this is what we would do. We'd say, he stays in my room. He stays in my room. And God gives me all my medicine in my room. Get close to the divine. God bless you. It's been such a blessing tonight. God bless.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you all. Good night, everybody.